you a lawful order! You are obstructing my investigation!
There is no investigation. There is only a house to save. Now stand down and let me do my job.
The heat was a physical thing, a solid wall pressing against him, trying to force him back down the ladder. Captain David Bishop ignored it. He'd lived in this world of superheated air and choking smoke for 20 years. His focus was absolute, a pinpoint of concentration in the roaring chaos. Below him, the crew of Engine 51 moved with the disciplined ballet of professionals. Hoses snaked across the lawn, axes bit into wood. And the steady thrum of the pumper truck was the heartbeat of the operation. The house on Elm Street was going up fast. A grease fire in the kitchen had found a path into the walls. And now the entire second story was a cauldron of orange and black. David's position on the 35-foot ladder gave him the perfect angle to attack the attic vents, to stop the beast from consuming the roof and causing a total collapse. "Pressure's good. Cap!" yelled his engineer, a young but steady firefighter named O'Malley. "Keep it steady," David yelled back, his voice muffled by his respirator. He adjusted his grip on the heavy brass nozzle, leaned his weight into the ladder's rungs, and sent a powerful stream of water blasting into the glowing orange vent. Steam and black smoke billowed out in a furious cloud. He was making progress. Another few minutes and they could punch a hole in the roof, ventilate the structure, and give the interior team a chance to push forward. Every second was a battle fought against physics and time. The family was out, safe on a neighbor's lawn, but the house, their home, their history, was dying in front of them. It was his job to save what he could. That was the only thing that mattered. That's when he heard it. Not the roar of the fire, or the crackle of burning timber, or the shouts of his men. It was a different sound, sharp and angry, cutting through the operational din. "Hey, you! Fireman! Move this goddamn truck!" David risked a glance downward. Standing beside the engine, silhouetted against the flashing red and blue lights of his own patrol car, was a police officer. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a buzz cut and an aggressive posture, his hand resting on his hip near his sidearm. His face was a mask of pure indignation. He was pointing a rigid finger at the massive, multi-ton fire engine as if it were a carelessly parked sedan. David ignored him. There was no time for this. He had a fire to fight. "I'm talking to you!" the officer screamed, his voice rising in pitch. "This engine is blocking the street. I need it moved, now!" Blocking the street. Of course it was blocking the street. It was a fire engine, connected to a hydrant, actively pumping thousands of gallons of water to the men fighting a structure fire. Its position wasn't random. It was dictated by the location of the fire, the hydrant, and the best tactical approach. O'Malley, standing at the pump panel, turned to the officer. "Sir, we're in the middle of an active fire suppression," O'Malley explained, his voice calm despite the officer's aggression. "We can't move the apparatus." "I don't give a damn what you're in the middle of," the officer shot back. "That is a lawful order. You are obstructing traffic. Move the vehicle immediately or I'll have you arrested." The sheer absurdity of the demand was staggering. Arrest him? For what? Operating the pump at a house fire? Down on the lawn? Lieutenant Miller, David's second-in-command, had broken off from directing the ground crew to intercept the officer. "Officer, what's the problem?" Miller asked, his own voice tight with disbelief. "The problem is this truck," the officer seethed, jabbing his finger again. "I need access. This is a public roadway. You will move it now." "Access to what?" Miller asked, his arms spread wide to encompass the scene. "The active fire? We're the only ones who are supposed to be here. The street is secured." "There's nowhere for you to go." From his perch on the ladder, David could feel the heat intensifying. A section of the roof near the chimney was starting to glow. A bad sign. They were losing their window. This ridiculous distraction was costing them precious seconds. He had to refocus. He turned his attention back to the attic vent, driving the water stream deep into the inferno. He couldn't let this sideshow compromise the mission. His crew, the homeowners, the house itself, they were his responsibility. The cop was just noise, but the noise wasn't going away. The argument below was escalating. The officer's voice grew louder, more belligerent. David could feel the vibrations of the shouting travel up the aluminum ladder. He risked another look. The officer was now face to face with Miller, his chest puffed out, radiating an aura of pure, unchecked authority. The scene was surreal. A man with a gun and a badge was threatening to shut down a life-saving operation because he was offended by the placement of their fire engine. It was a level of ego so profound, so dangerously disconnected from reality, that it defied all logic. David had seen a lot in his 2 decades on the job. Panicked victims, grieving families, even hostile bystanders, but he had never seen a fellow first responder actively work to sabotage an emergency scene. The fire didn't care about jurisdiction or ego. It just burned. And while this cop was playing king of the road, the fire was winning. Captain David Bishop wasn't just a firefighter. He was an institution within the Aurora Fire Department. At 45, his face was a roadmap of a career spent in the crucible of heat and crisis, lined with the faint traces of smoke and worry, but his eyes held the steady, assessing calm of a man who had seen the worst and learned to navigate it. He joined the department at 25, a young man forged by a stint in the Army, carrying with him a sense of discipline and purpose that fire service amplified. Over 2 decades, he'd climbed the ranks from probie to engineer, from lieutenant to captain of one of the busiest engine companies in the city. His personnel file was thick with commendations, a Medal of Valor for pulling 2 children from a flashover, a unit citation for his leadership during the historic downtown warehouse fire, and dozens of letters from grateful citizens whose lives or homes he had helped save. He was known for his composure, his almost preternatural ability to slow down a chaotic scene in his own mind, to see the tactical angles and make the right call under immense pressure. He'd taught academy classes on structure fire dynamics and served on the department's apparatus design committee. When David Bishop was the officer in charge, crews felt a sense of confidence. They knew the job would be done right, and that their captain would never ask them to take a risk he wouldn't take himself. He was the kind of leader who earned respect not through his rank, but through his competence. He understood that in his line of work, authority wasn't about demanding compliance. It was about building trust. He was a black man who had risen to a command position in a historically white institution, and he'd done it by being undeniably, exceptionally good at his job. He'd faced subtle prejudices and overcome unspoken barriers, but on the fire ground, respect was the only currency that mattered, and David Bishop was wealthy in it. Officer Mark Keller, age 28, understood authority differently. He'd been with the Aurora Police Department for just 4 years, but in that short time, he had managed to accumulate 19 civilian complaints. They ranged from excessive force during traffic stops and rude conduct during public interactions to more serious allegations of illegal searches. The Internal Affairs Department had a file on him that was growing at an alarming rate, yet none of the complaints had ever resulted in more than a written reprimand. The department had a culture of protecting its own, and Keller had learned quickly that the badge and the uniform were a shield. He saw the world in stark, simple terms. There were cops, and there was everyone else. Compliance wasn't a request, it was a non-negotiable demand. Any hesitation, any question, was perceived as a challenge to his authority, an act of defiance that had to be crushed immediately. He'd joined the force right out of community college. drawn not by a desire to serve the community, but by the promise of action and power. He saw himself as a warrior in a battle against societal decay, and every interaction was a potential conflict, every citizen a potential suspect. He was known among his fellow officers as having a short fuse, a cop who was always dialed up to 11. More seasoned officers kept their distance, recognizing the telltale signs of someone who was more of a liability than an asset, but in a department stretched thin and struggling with recruitment. Officers like Keller often slipped through the cracks. His performance reviews noted his high number of arrests and traffic citations, framing it as proactive policing, while glossing over the trail of angry, resentful citizens he left in his wake. He believed his badge gave him absolute authority in any situation, a universal key that unlocked every door and superseded every other professional's judgment. He had operated this way for 4 years without any real consequences, until he rolled up to a house fire on a sunny Tuesday afternoon and decided that a fire engine was a personal insult. This fundamental clash of philosophies was now playing out in real time on the lawn of Elm Street. Below David's ladder, Lieutenant Miller was trying to reason with a man who was immune to reason. "Officer, with all due respect, Captain Bishop is the incident commander here," Miller stated, trying to appeal to the chain of command. "The placement of this apparatus is a tactical decision based on saving that family's home. We are not moving it." "I don't care who your incident commander is." Keller spat, the words dripping with disdain. "This is a police matter now. You are failing to obey a lawful order." He unclipped the radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch. I have fire department personnel refusing to clear the roadway. They are obstructing a police investigation." An investigation into what? David wondered from his perch. The fire was accidental, a simple cooking mishap. There was no crime, no suspect, no investigation to be had. This was a fabrication, a desperate attempt by Keller to create a context in which his authority was paramount. He was inventing a crime so he could enforce the law. The fire behind David roared, a stark reminder of the actual, tangible crisis that Keller was willfully ignoring. The smoke was thicker now, a greasy, black column polluting the blue sky. The fight for the house was being lost, not to the flames, but to the fragile ego of one man on the ground. The argument below had now drawn the attention of the entire ground crew. 2 other firefighters, Harris and Chen, had paused their work, tools in hand, watching the bizarre confrontation unfold. The homeowners, a middle-aged couple, huddled on their neighbor's lawn, their expressions of grief now mixed with utter confusion. They were watching a police officer berate the very men trying to save their property. It was a scene from a dark comedy, except the house was very real and the flames were still spreading. From his vantage point, David could see the fire beginning to push through the roof shingles in a new spot. They were seconds away from losing the entire roof structure. If that happened, the fight was over. The strategy would shift from an offensive interior attack to a defensive exterior one, where the only goal was to pour water on the inferno to stop it from spreading to the neighboring houses. It meant conceding the home as a total loss. They were on the precipice of that decision, and it was being forced upon them not by the fire, but by Officer Keller. "Final warning," Keller shouted, his hand now hovering over his handcuffs. "Move the truck, or I'm taking you in for obstruction." Lieutenant Miller, a man with 15 years on the job and the patience of a saint, was finally losing his composure. "Are you out of your mind? We are in the middle of a firefight. Look at that house!" He pointed a gloved hand at the second story, where flames were now licking out of a shattered window frame. "A family's life is going up in smoke and you're worried about a traffic jam that doesn't exist?" "I am the law here," Keller stated flatly, as if it were a line from a movie. "And I am ordering you to move this vehicle, It was then that David knew he had to intervene. He couldn't afford to let Miller get arrested. He couldn't afford this distraction any longer. He shut off the nozzle, the sudden silence from his hose adding to the tension. He secured it in its bracket on the ladder. "Miller, stand down!" David called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of command. He started to back down the ladder, each step deliberate. He needed to handle this himself. As the captain, it was his responsibility. When his boots hit the ground, he strode directly toward Keller, pulling off his helmet and running a hand over his sweat-soaked head. His face was smudged with soot, his eyes red from the smoke. He looked every bit the part of a man who had just stepped out of a battle. "Officer," David said, keeping his voice level and professional, a stark contrast to Keller's frantic shouting. "I'm Captain David Bishop, the incident commander. My lieutenant was correct. This engine is positioned for optimal fire suppression. It will not be moved until this fire is under control. The street is closed for public safety. You are welcome to park your vehicle at the end of the block, but this scene is now under the authority of the fire department." He had stated it plainly, professionally, and by the book. In any multi-agency emergency scene, jurisdiction was clear. If there was a fire, the fire department was in charge. If there was a crime, the police were in charge. This was a fire. It was his scene. Keller seemed momentarily taken aback by David's direct approach, but his bravado quickly returned, amplified. He saw David not as a fellow first responder, but as a new, more significant challenge to his authority. "I don't care what your title is," Keller sneered. "You are all obstructing justice. I've given a lawful order, and you are refusing. That's a crime." "There is no justice to obstruct, officer," David replied, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "There is only a house to save. My crew and I are doing our jobs. I suggest you go and do yours, which would be to secure the perimeter and keep civilians away. Not harass firefighters." Something in David's tone, the calm, unwavering authority that came not from a badge, but from 2 decades of life and death experience, seemed to snap whatever restraint Keller had left. His eyes narrowed and a vein pulsed in his temple. This was the ultimate act of defiance in his worldview. A black man, a firefighter, was telling him, a police officer, what to do. "You think you're in charge here?" Keller said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He took a step closer, invading David's personal space. The smell of burning pine and melting vinyl hung heavy in the air between them. The house groaned, a deep, structural sound that signaled its imminent collapse. David didn't flinch. "I don't think it... I know it. This is my scene. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a house to save." He turned his back on Keller, a clear dismissal, and started walking back toward the ladder. It was a calculated risk. He was betting that the sheer ridiculousness of the situation would force Keller to back down, to realize the absurdity of his own position. It was a bet he would lose. As David turned his back, he heard the quick scuff of boots on the pavement behind him. Before he could react, a hand clamped down on his shoulder, yanking him backward with surprising force. He stumbled, his heavy gear throwing him off balance. He spun around to see Officer Keller's face inches from his, contorted with rage. "You don't walk away from me!" Keller screamed, his voice cracking. "You are under arrest!" The words hung in the air, so completely disconnected from reality that for a moment, no one moved. David's crew stared in stunned silence. The homeowners gasped. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. "Under arrest?" David said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "For what? For doing my job?" "For obstruction of justice and resisting a lawful order," Keller shouted, fumbling at his belt for his handcuffs. This was the moment the scene fractured. when the unreality of the threat became a physical, tangible event. Miller and O'Malley both took a step forward, their instincts to defend their captain kicking in. "Whoa! Hey! Back off!" Keller yelled, pointing a finger at them. "You'll be next!" David held up a hand, signaling his men to stop. He couldn't let them get drawn into this. If he got arrested, the department would sort it out. If his whole crew got arrested, the house was gone and their careers would be in jeopardy. He had to contain the damage. "Officer, listen to me very carefully," David said, his voice now cold and hard as steel. "If you put those cuffs on me, you are making the biggest mistake of your career. You are actively interfering with an emergency operation. That house is about to collapse. People's lives are at stake. Stand down." It was his last attempt at reason, an appeal to the sliver of professional sense he hoped Keller still possessed. But Keller was too far gone. He was operating on pure ego, trapped in a feedback loop of his own making. To back down now would be to admit he was wrong. And in his world, that was impossible. "Turn around," Keller ordered, brandishing the handcuffs. "Put your hands behind your back." David didn't move. He stood his ground, a captain in his turnout gear, soot on his face, in the middle of a fire scene, being threatened with arrest for trying to save a home. The absurdity was a physical weight. "No," David said simply. The word was quiet, but it resonated with the force of a thunderclap. That was all the justification Keller needed. He lunged forward, grabbing David's arm and trying to wrench it behind his back. But David was a solid man, conditioned by years of carrying heavy equipment and forcing doors. He stood like a rock. Keller struggled, his face turning red with exertion and fury. "Stop resisting," he grunted, though David was doing nothing more than standing still. The commotion caught the eye of a neighbor across the street who had been filming the fire on their phone. The lens, which had been pointed at the burning house, now swung down to capture the unbelievable scene on the ground. A police officer wrestling with a fire captain while flames raged in the background. Keller, realizing he couldn't manhandle David alone, reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, I need backup. I have a subject actively resisting arrest." The call was a lie, a desperate escalation. Hearing it, David made a split-second decision. A physical fight would only make things worse, for him and for his crew. He let his body go limp, a sign of concession. He would let this play out. Let the system he'd trusted for 20 years deal with the consequences. "Fine," David said, his voice laced with disgust. "You win." He turned and placed his hands behind his back. Keller, emboldened by the surrender, roughly shoved him against the side of the fire engine. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around David's wrists, the sound sharp and final. He was a prisoner on his own fire scene. Miller rushed forward. "You can't do this! He's the captain! We need him!" Keller spun around, his hand on his taser. "Get back, or you're next! I swear to God!" He grabbed David by the arm and started marching him toward his patrol car. As he was being led away, David looked back at the house. The section of roof he'd been worried about finally gave way. A shower of sparks and embers erupted into the sky as a large portion of the structure collapsed inward. A collective groan went up from the watching neighbors. The fire, freed from the confines of the attic, roared with new life. His crew stood frozen, watching their leader being taken away in handcuffs, their faces a mixture of shock, fury, and helplessness. They had lost their captain, and now they had lost the house. The back of a patrol car is a small, hard world of plastic and steel. It's designed for containment, to isolate and dehumanize. For David, it was a cage. He sat on the molded bench, his thick turnout coat bunching up uncomfortably behind him, the handcuffs biting into his wrists every time the car moved. The metal partition separating him from the front seat was a solid barrier, a physical representation of the chasm that had just opened between two brotherhoods of first responders. Officer Keller got in, slammed the door, and took a deep, shaky breath. He was breathing like a man who had just won a physical fight, his adrenaline still pumping. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting David's for a brief, charged moment. There was no remorse in his expression, no flicker of doubt, only a grim, self-satisfied certainty. He had faced a challenge to his authority, and he had vanquished it. In his mind, he had done his job. He keyed his radio. Dispatch, show 1 in custody. Transporting to central booking. 10-4, the dispatcher's voice crackled back. David stared out the side window, watching the scene he was supposed to be commanding recede into the distance. He could see his crew, leaderless and in disarray, trying to regroup. Miller was shouting orders, but the disciplined ballet had broken down. They were transitioning to a defensive attack, pulling back from the house, their body language screaming defeat. The powerful streams from their hoses were no longer aimed at specific targets inside the structure, but were now just arcing into the sky. A desperate attempt to drown the inferno and protect the houses on either side. It was the firefighting equivalent of a surrender. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, and the burning home disappeared from view, replaced by the mundane scenery of a suburban neighborhood. But David could still see the flames in his mind, could still feel the heat on his skin. A bitter, metallic taste filled his mouth. It was the taste of failure. Not his failure, he knew, but a failure of the system. A failure of one man's ego that had cascaded into a catastrophic loss for an innocent family. The silence in the car was thick and suffocating. David focused on his breathing, using the techniques he'd learned to stay calm in zero-visibility, smoke-filled rooms. Stay calm. Assess. Don't let the anger consume you. Anger was a secondary emotion. The primary emotion was a profound sense of betrayal. He and Keller wore different uniforms, but they were supposed to be on the same side. Partners in the chaotic business of public safety. He had run into burning buildings while police officers secured the scene. He had cut people out of mangled cars while officers directed traffic. It was a symbiotic relationship built on mutual respect for each other's expertise. Keller had shattered that pact. "You know that house is gone, right?" David said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "That family just lost everything they own because you needed to prove a point." Keller adjusted his mirror, refusing to look at him directly. "You should have followed a lawful order. This is on you. You're the one who obstructed." The circular logic was impenetrable. Keller had constructed a reality where he was the victim, the righteous enforcer whose legitimate actions were thwarted by an uncooperative firefighter. He had already written the narrative in his head, the one that would go into his report. "What was the investigation I was obstructing?" David asked, genuinely curious to hear the lie. "That's police business," Keller said dismissively. "You don't have a need to know." David leaned his head back against the hard plastic of the seat and closed his eyes. There was no point in arguing. The damage was done. His focus had to shift from the fire he couldn't fight to the one that was coming. The legal fire, the political fire. He knew the fire chief would be notified within minutes. He knew the union would be called. He knew this single, insane act by one patrol officer was about to ignite a firestorm between the two largest public safety departments in the city. The drive to the downtown precinct took 15 minutes, as they pulled into the Sally Port, the secure garage where prisoners were brought in. David felt a new wave of humiliation. He was being brought in like a common criminal. The automatic door rumbled shut behind them, sealing him inside the guts of the justice system. Keller came around and opened his door, grabbing him by the arm to lead him out. "Let's go." "Captain," Keller said, the word captain dripping with sarcasm. As Keller led him toward the booking desk, a few other officers looked up. Their initial expressions were of idle curiosity, which quickly morphed into confusion and then outright shock as they recognized the uniform and the man wearing it. This wasn't some drunk or shoplifter. This was a fire captain, still in his soot-stained gear, being brought in handcuffs. One of them, a gray-haired sergeant who David recognized from a multi-car pileup they'd worked together last winter, just shook his head slowly, a look of weary disgust on his face. He knew, as David knew, that this was more than just an arrest. It was a declaration of war. The booking area of the central precinct was a sterile, impersonal space designed for efficiency. It smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. Under the flat, fluorescent lights, Officer Keller formally handed David over to the custody of the booking sergeant, a heavy-set, world-weary man named Costello. "What we got here?" "Keller?" Costello asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "One for obstruction of justice and resisting," Keller announced with a hint of pride in his voice. Costello finally looked up, and his eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he took in the scene. He looked at David's turnout gear, the captain insignia on his collar, the soot on his face, and then back at Keller. He let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "You're kidding me, right?" Costello said, his voice flat. "He refused to obey a lawful order at an active scene," Keller stated, puffing out his chest. "He's lucky I'm not adding more charges." Costello leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Keller. He'd been a cop for 30 years. He'd seen rookies with an authority problem before, but this was a new level of stupid. "An active scene? You mean a fire? You arrested the fire captain? At a fire?" "He was blocking my investigation," Keller insisted, his story already starting to sound thin under the fluorescent lights of the precinct, away from the adrenaline of the scene. "Right," Costello said, the single word carrying a mountain of doubt. He turned his attention to David. "Captain, I'm going to have to process you. We'll get this sorted out, I promise." The tone was one of apology, an acknowledgement of the absurdity of the situation. The process began. It was a slow, methodical stripping away of dignity. The handcuffs were removed, only to be replaced by the impersonal handling of the booking procedure. Fingerprints, photographs. His pockets were emptied, his wallet, his keys, his phone. The booking officer logged each item meticulously. When he pulled out David's fire department ID, he paused, looking at the photo of a smiling, proud man in his dress uniform, then at the weary, soot-covered man standing in front of him. As this was happening, the precinct's main phone line began to light up. The desk sergeant answered a call, listened for a moment, and his posture straightened. "Yes, Chief. Yes, I understand. He's in booking now. Yes, sir." He hung up and immediately dialed an extension. "Get the watch commander out here, now. Fire Chief Thompson is on his way down, and he sounds unhappy." The word spread through the precinct like wildfire. A low murmur started to build. Officers who had been at their desks typing reports were now standing in doorways. Looking toward the booking area, the atmosphere shifted from routine to tense. They all knew what this meant. This wasn't just a bad arrest. This was an interdepartmental incident of the highest order. The fire chief wasn't just a boss. He was a political figure with the mayor's ear. Keller, who had been standing off to the side trying to look nonchalant, was now starting to look nervous. The self-satisfied smirk was gone, replaced by a defensive scowl. He could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him, and the looks weren't of support, but of condemnation. He had brought a storm down on all of them. A lieutenant, the watch commander, strode into the booking area, his face a thunderous mask. He was a tall, imposing man named Captain Wallace. He ignored David completely and got right in Keller's face, his voice a low, controlled hiss that was more intimidating than any shout. "My office! Now!" Wallace commanded. "And you better have a damn good reason for what you've done, because I've just spent 5 minutes getting screamed at by a man who can end your career with a single phone call." Keller, his face now pale, followed Wallace down the hall. As he walked away, the other officers in the room wouldn't meet his eyes. He was an island, and the tide was going out. Costello finished David's paperwork. "Look, Captain," he said quietly, "we got to put you in a holding cell until a supervisor signs off on the release. It's procedure, but I'll get you coffee, and I'll make sure the door stays unlocked." It was the smallest of kindnesses, a tiny act of rebellion against the madness of the situation. But to David, it meant the world. It was a sign that not everyone had lost their mind. He was led to a small, concrete cell. The heavy metal door clanged shut, but as promised, the lock didn't engage. He sat on the hard metal bench. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, he was alone with his thoughts. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a cold, simmering rage. He thought of the family from Elm Street. He thought of their home, now a smoldering ruin. He thought of his crew, left to face that inferno without him. And he thought of Officer Mark Keller, a man whose ego was so vast it could swallow a house whole. This was no longer just about a bad arrest. It was about accountability. David had been in the holding cell for less than 20 minutes when he heard a new voice in the booking area. It was a voice that didn't belong in a police precinct, calm, articulate, and carrying an unmistakable air of expensive, razor-sharp authority. "I'm Marcus Thorne, counsel for the Firefighters Union. I'm here to see my client, Captain David Bishop. He is being held illegally, and I want him released immediately." The watch commander, Captain Wallace, came out to meet him. "Mr. Thorne, we're in the middle of processing the situation." "Processing?" Thorne's voice was laced with incredulity. "There is nothing to process. You have a fire captain who was arrested, in his full turnout gear, while commanding an active fire scene. This isn't a situation. It's a constitutional crisis in miniature. Where is he?" David stood up and walked to the bars of his cell. A man in a perfectly tailored gray suit stood in the middle of the booking room. Marcus Thorne was in his early 50s, with sharp features and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room simultaneously. He had a reputation as the city's most formidable civil rights attorney, a legal pit bull who the union kept on retainer for precisely this kind of situation. When Thorne showed up, it meant the gloves were coming off. Thorne's eyes found David in the cell, and he strode over, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. "Captain Bishop, Marcus Thorne, are you injured?" "Just my pride," David said, his voice raspy. "We'll get that back, with interest," Thorne said, a grim smile touching his lips. He turned to Captain Wallace. "Get him out of that cell, now, or my next call is to a federal judge to report an unlawful detention and a violation of your own interagency protocols. I assure you, he will not be pleased to be woken up for this." Wallace, clearly outmatched and overwhelmed, nodded to Sergeant Costello. "Let him out." The cell door swung open. As David stepped out, Fire Chief Thompson came storming into the booking area. He was a barrel-chested man with a shock of white hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was still in his uniform, having come straight from the fire scene. He ignored everyone else and walked directly to David. "Are you okay, Dave?" he asked, his voice full of genuine concern. "I'm fine. Chief, the house. We lost it." The chief's face hardened. "I know. I saw. This is a disgrace." He turned his furious gaze on Wallace. "Your officer didn't just arrest my captain, he cost a family their home. I want his badge, I want his job, and I want a full public apology from your department by morning." "Chief, we are taking this very seriously," Wallace began, but Thorne cut him off. "Seriously isn't good enough," Thorne said, pulling a leather-bound notepad and a pen from his jacket. "We will be requiring copies of all relevant documents: Officer Keller's incident report, his body camera footage, the dispatch recordings, and a list of every complaint ever filed against him. You have 24 hours to provide them." He then turned to David. "Captain, I need you to tell me everything that happened. From the moment the officer arrived, don't leave anything out." Right there, in the middle of the chaotic booking area, David recounted the entire incident. He described Keller's irrational demands, his escalating aggression, his fabricated investigation, and the final, unbelievable act of pulling him off his duty to place him in handcuffs. As he spoke, Thorne took meticulous notes, his pen scratching across the page. He asked sharp, clarifying questions. "Did he ever identify what specific law you were breaking?" "He just kept saying obstruction." "Did he ever read you your rights?" "No." "Were there witnesses?" "My entire crew, the homeowners, and a neighbor across the street was filming with their phone." Thorne's eyes lit up at that last piece of information. "A civilian recording? Excellent." He closed his notepad. "Okay, here's what's going to happen. The criminal charges against you will be dropped before they ever see a prosecutor's desk. They are frivolous and retaliatory. That is the end of their story. It is the beginning of ours." He turned back to Wallace and Chief Thompson. "This was not just a mistake. This was a violation of Captain Bishop's civil rights, an act of gross negligence that resulted in significant property loss and an unacceptable breach of public trust. The city will be hearing from us." His tone left no room for negotiation. He wasn't there to ask for favors or smooth things over. He was there to draw a battle line. He put a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "Let's go, Captain. We're done here." As David and Marcus Thorne walked out of the precinct, leaving a trail of stunned and scrambling police command staff in their wake, David felt a shift inside him. The helplessness he'd felt in the back of the patrol car was being replaced by something else, a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for every firefighter who had ever been on a chaotic scene, for every first responder whose professional judgment had been questioned by someone with a badge and an ego. This ended here. Walking out of the police precinct and into the late afternoon sun felt like surfacing after being held underwater. The air was fresh. The sounds of the city were normal, a stark contrast to the recycled air and tense silence of the station. Lieutenant Miller and the rest of Engine 51's crew were waiting for him on the sidewalk. They had been relieved from the Elm Street fire and had come straight to the precinct. Their faces, stained with soot and exhaustion, were etched with a mixture of relief and anger. Miller was the first to speak. "Captain, you okay?" "I'm fine," David said, the words feeling inadequate. "How's the crew?" "We're pissed off, Cap," O'Malley said, his young face tight with fury. "But we're okay." "The house?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. Miller's expression turned grim. He shook his head slowly. "Total loss. By the time they let us get back to work properly, the roof was gone, and the second floor had collapsed into the first. It was a surround and drown operation by then. We just poured water on it for another hour until it was out. He kicked at a loose piece of gravel on the sidewalk. The fire marshal's preliminary report is going to state that the operational delay was a significant factor in the structure's failure. He said another 10 minutes of uninterrupted work when you were on that ladder, and we probably could have saved most of it. The words landed like body blows. 10 minutes. A lifetime on a fire scene. 10 minutes was the time Keller had spent arguing, threatening, and ultimately arresting him. A family was homeless tonight because of those 10 minutes. The weight of that settled on David's shoulders, heavier than any air pack. He had done everything right, followed every procedure, made every correct tactical decision, but he had been stopped by a force he couldn't fight, institutional ego. Marcus Thorne, who had been observing the reunion, stepped forward. "Listen to me, all of you," he said, his voice commanding their attention. "You are all witnesses to this. I'll be taking your official statements tomorrow. For now, do not speak about this to anyone. Not the media, not other crews, not even your spouses. The police department is going to be in damage control mode. They will try to spin this, to leak parts of Keller's report, to paint Captain Bishop as uncooperative or aggressive. We need to control the narrative, and we do that by staying silent and letting the facts speak for themselves in a courtroom." The crew nodded in understanding. They were disciplined professionals. They understood following a chain of command. For now, Marcus Thorne was their commander. Chief Thompson emerged from the precinct, his face still like a thundercloud. He put a hand on David's shoulder. "Dave, the department stands with you 100%. Go home. Get some rest. I'm placing you on administrative leave, with pay, effective immediately. Not as a punishment," he added quickly, seeing the look on David's face. "As a necessity. You're about to be the center of a major legal battle. You can't be on the street while this is happening." David hated it, but he understood. He was no longer just a fire captain. He was a plaintiff. As his crew drove him home, the city lights blurred past the window. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. For 20 years, his life had been a predictable rhythm of 24-hour shifts, punctuated by bells and sirens. He was a man of action, a problem solver. Now, he was being told to sit on the sidelines while lawyers and politicians fought a battle in his name. When he got to his small, quiet house, the smell of smoke still clinging to his clothes felt like an accusation. He stripped off his uniform, throwing it in a pile on the floor of the laundry room. He stood under a scalding hot shower for a long time, trying to wash away the grime of the fire and the filth of the jail cell. But it was no use. The humiliation was deeper than skin. He spent the rest of the evening sitting in his backyard, staring at the darkening sky. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls and texts from fellow firefighters across the city, all offering support, all expressing their outrage. The story was already a legend in the making. But David felt no sense of vindication. All he could see was the face of the homeowner, a woman who had been weeping silently on her neighbor's lawn as she watched her memories turn to ash. He had looked her in the eye when he first arrived on scene and promised her they would do everything they could. He had failed that promise. He hadn't been beaten by the fire. He had been beaten by a cop with something to prove. And that was a truth that no shower could ever wash away. 3 days later, the lawsuit was filed. It wasn't a simple complaint. It was a legal bombshell, meticulously crafted by Marcus Thorne and his team. Captain David Bishop versus Officer Mark Keller, the Aurora Police Department, and the City of Aurora. The charges were severe: violation of 4th and 14th Amendment rights, false arrest, malicious prosecution, and interference with emergency services resulting in catastrophic property loss. The document was a masterpiece of legal narrative, laying out the events of that afternoon with cold, clinical precision. It included timestamps from the fire dispatch system, the address of the civilian witness with the video, and a preliminary damage assessment of the lost home that ran into the high six figures. The filing made immediate headlines. The local news channels led their evening broadcasts with the story, playing the same short, grainy clip of David being handcuffed in front of the burning house that was now starting to circulate online. The city was suddenly under a microscope. The police department's initial response was defensive and dismissive. In a hastily arranged press conference, the police chief, a man named Michael O'Connell, stood at a podium and offered a lukewarm statement. "We are aware of the lawsuit," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "There is an active internal affairs investigation into the incident. Officer Keller remains on active duty. We believe our officers have the discretion to maintain order and public safety at any scene, and we will defend their actions in court." It was a classic institutional defense. Circle the wagons, admit nothing, and paint the officer as the one in control. The statement was a slap in the face to David, to Chief Thompson, and to the entire fire department. It was also a massive strategic error. Marcus Thorne knew a weak position when he saw one. "They're arrogant," he told David during a meeting in his downtown law office. "They think they can bully their way through this. They think the public will automatically side with a cop over a firefighter. They're about to find out how wrong they are." The city's legal department, acting on the police department's recommendation, reached out to Thorne with a settlement offer. It was so low, it was insulting. "They're offering $25,000, Thorne said, a wry smile on his face. "Nuisance value. They want us to believe this is just a minor disagreement between first responders that got out of hand. They want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement, take the pocket change, and let this all disappear quietly so they can protect their problem officer." David looked at Thorne, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he considered it. He could take the money, put this whole ugly chapter behind him, and try to get back to his life, back to the job he loved. But then he thought of Keller's sneering face. He thought of the clicking sound of the handcuffs. He thought of the family who now had nothing but a pile of ash and charred timber where their home used to be. "No," David said, the word coming out sharp and clear. "Not a chance," Thorne beamed. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. I've already sent them my response." "What did you tell them?" David asked. "I told them we'd see them in court, and that our opening settlement demand is $20 million. The city's lawyers scoffed at the number. They saw it as posturing, an absurdly high figure meant for negotiation. They failed to understand that Thorne wasn't negotiating. He was sending a message. This wasn't about a quick payday. This was about punishment. It was about accountability on a scale the city had never seen before. The rejection of their lowball offer and Thorne's astronomical counter-demand finally signaled to the city's administration that this was not a problem that would simply go away. They had two choices: either take Officer Keller off the street and begin a serious negotiation, or double down on their defense and prepare for a long, expensive, and very public war. Blinded by a combination of institutional loyalty and a profound underestimation of the evidence against them, they chose to fight. They assigned two of their top litigators to the case and began preparing their defense. Their strategy was simple. They would attack David's credibility. They would claim he was insubordinate, that he had created a safety risk, and that Officer Keller was simply doing his job by restoring order to a chaotic scene. They were preparing to argue that a fire captain, a 20-year veteran with a spotless record, was the one who had acted recklessly, while a 28-year-old patrolman with 19 complaints was the voice of reason. It was a strategy born of desperation, and it was about to blow up in their faces. In the age of the smartphone, Every citizen is a potential journalist, and every event has the potential to become a global spectacle. The neighbor who had been filming the fire on Elm Street, a quiet IT manager named Ben Carter, hadn't thought much of the footage at first. He'd been focused on the flames, but later that night, watching the news and hearing the police department's official statement, he grew angry. The chief's story didn't match what he had seen with his own eyes. What he had seen was a calm, professional firefighter being assaulted and arrested by an out-of-control police officer. He rewatched the video on his phone. It was clearer than he remembered. His phone was new, with a high-quality camera. The footage was shaky, but it captured the entire confrontation in stunning detail. It captured Miller's attempts to reason with Keller. It captured David's calm, authoritative intervention. It captured Keller's rage, the physical act of yanking David back, the struggle, and the final, damning click of the handcuffs. Most importantly, it captured the audio clearly. Every irrational demand from Keller, every professional response from David. Ben Carter wasn't an activist, but he believed in fairness. He uploaded the 2-minute clip to his social media page with a simple caption: "I watched the Aurora FD try to save my neighbor's house today, until one APD officer decided his ego was more important. This is what really happened." The video smoldered online for a few hours, shared among friends and local community groups. Then, someone with a larger following shared it. Then a local news blogger. By the next morning, it had been picked up by a national news aggregator. By noon, it was an explosion. The video went viral on a scale that no one could have anticipated. It had all the elements of a compelling drama: a hero, a villain, a life-or-death situation, and a shocking abuse of power. The optics were catastrophic for the police department. The image of a soot-covered firefighter in full gear being handcuffed while a house burned in the background was visceral, powerful, and needed no explanation. #firefighter arrest and #justice for Captain Bishop began trending nationally. The video was played on a loop on every major cable news network. Pundits from across the political spectrum weighed in, and for once, they were almost unanimous in their condemnation of the officer's actions. Fire departments from across the country began posting messages of solidarity with David and the Aurora FD. The International Association of Firefighters released a scathing statement demanding Officer Keller's immediate termination and prosecution. The viral video completely changed the landscape of the case. The Court of Public Opinion had convened, watched the evidence, and delivered a swift and brutal verdict. The police department's carefully crafted narrative about a defiant firefighter was incinerated by 2 minutes of objective, undeniable truth. The pressure on the city became immense. The mayor's office was flooded with angry calls and email. Protesters, a mix of off-duty firefighters and supportive citizens, began holding small but vocal rallies outside police headquarters. The city council demanded an emergency session to be briefed on the lawsuit and the department's handling of the incident. For Officer Mark Keller, the video was a digital pillory. His name and face were everywhere. He became the living embodiment of police overreach. The 19 complaints that had been quietly filed away in an internal affairs office were leaked to the press, and the details of his past conduct painted an even uglier picture. He was placed on paid administrative leave, a move the department had resisted just days earlier. But it was too little, too late. The shield that had protected him for 4 years had been shattered. Inside Marcus Thorne's office, he and David watched the fallout. Thorne had received a copy of the video from Ben Carter and had already filed it as an exhibit in their case. "This is our opening argument, our closing argument, and every argument in between," Thorne said, gesturing to the video playing on his large monitor. "A jury will see this, and for them, the case will be over. Everything else is just a matter of calculating the damages." The city's lawyers knew it too. Their strategy of attacking David's credibility was now impossible. How could they argue he was the aggressor when the entire world could see him standing calmly, trying to do his job, before being physically assaulted? The viral video hadn't just handed Thorne a piece of evidence, it had handed him a nuke. The city's arrogant refusal to settle for a reasonable amount early on now looked like an act of spectacular self-sabotage. They were trapped, and the price of their hubris was about to go up. With the lawsuit in full swing, the legal process moved into the discovery phase. This was the period where both sides were compelled to share all of their evidence. For Marcus Thorne, it was like being a kid in a candy store. The city, now reeling from the public relations nightmare of the viral video, could no longer hide behind bureaucratic stonewalling. They were forced by court order to turn over everything Thorne had requested. The first item to arrive was Officer Keller's personnel file. It was even worse than the leaks had suggested. It was a detailed portrait of a ticking time bomb. Complaint after complaint detailed a pattern of behavior, unnecessary escalations, verbal abuse, and a consistent belief that any form of questioning was an act of insubordination worthy of punishment. The file showed that multiple supervisors had flagged Keller for anger management issues, but he had only ever been sent to a one-day online de-escalation course. It was a classic case of an institution recognizing a problem but choosing the cheapest, easiest, and least effective way to address it. Next came the dispatch recordings. The audio captured Keller's initial call, his voice already agitated as he reported the fire engine blocking the road. It then recorded his increasingly frantic calls for backup to handle a resisting subject, a narrative completely at odds with the calm, professional voices of the fire department personnel on their own channel, who were reporting an officer interfering with operations. The two sets of recordings, played side by side, would paint a stark picture for a jury of two parallel realities, one based on fact, the other on fiction. But the most damning piece of evidence was Officer Keller's own body camera footage. The police department had fought hard to keep it under seal, arguing it was part of an ongoing internal investigation. Thorne filed a motion to compel, and the judge, having seen the civilian video, granted it immediately. When the digital file arrived, Thorne and David watched it together in a darkened conference room. The footage was even more powerful than the neighbor's video because it was from Keller's own perspective. The video began as he pulled up to the scene. There was no traffic. No one was being blocked. His entire justification for the confrontation was a lie from the very first second. The camera captured him getting out of his car and striding purposefully toward the fire engine, already spoiling for a fight. The audio was crystal clear. It captured his every word, every threat. It also captured the responses from David's crew, their voices calm and patient as they tried to explain the situation. When David came down from the ladder, the camera showed him standing at a respectful distance, his hands open and non-threatening. Keller, by contrast, could be seen puffing up his chest and stepping into David's space, an act of physical intimidation. The most crucial moment was when David turned his back to return to the ladder. The camera lens jerked as Keller lunged forward to grab him. The audio captured Keller's strained grunts as he tried to manhandle David, and his false shouts of, "Stop resisting!" even as the camera showed David standing perfectly still. It was an objective, first-person record of an officer manufacturing a confrontation, escalating it, and then lying about it in real time to his dispatcher. It was a prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's worst nightmare. Thorne paused the video, the image of Keller's hand grabbing David's arm frozen on the screen. "He just handed us the case on a silver platter," Thorne said, his voice quiet with awe. "He documented his own assault, his own false arrest, and his own lies. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen a piece of evidence this self-incriminating." For David, watching the footage was a strange, out-of-body experience. He was reliving the worst moment of his professional life, but this time, he was seeing it through his attacker's eyes. He saw the contempt in Keller's body language, heard the irrational rage in his voice, and understood in a way he hadn't before that nothing he could have said or done would have changed the outcome. Keller had arrived on that scene looking for a fight, and he was determined to have one, regardless of the facts or the consequences. The body camera footage was the final nail in the city's coffin. Their legal position had gone from weak to indefensible. They could no longer claim their officer was acting in good faith. The video proved he was acting in bad faith. With malice, Thorne immediately filed a new motion, adding a claim for punitive damages, arguing that Keller's conduct was so egregious that the city shouldn't just compensate David for his suffering. They should be punished for allowing an officer like Keller to wear a badge and carry a gun. The price of the city's arrogance had just gone up again. The deposition was held in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm. A court reporter sat at one end of the long mahogany table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine. David was there with Marcus Thorne. Across from them sat Officer Mark Keller and two tense-looking attorneys from the city's legal department. A videographer aimed a camera at Keller, recording the entire proceeding for the official record. Keller, dressed in a suit that looked a size too tight, tried to project an air of confidence, but his constantly shifting gaze and the small muscle twitching in his jaw betrayed his nervousness. This wasn't a street corner where he could control the situation through intimidation. This was Marcus Thorne's world, and the rules were very different. Thorne began gently, asking Keller to state his name, rank, and years of service. He then walked him through his training, establishing the basics of police procedure and interagency cooperation. Then, he moved to the day of the fire. Officer Keller, when you arrived on Elm Street, what was the first thing you observed? Thorne asked, his tone conversational. I observed a fire engine illegally blocking a public roadway, Keller said, reciting the line from his report. Illegally? Thorne raised an eyebrow. What law was being broken? It was obstructing traffic. But there was no traffic, was there, officer? Thorne countered. The street was blocked off at both ends by your own patrol cars. Your own body camera footage shows no other vehicles on the street. Who exactly was being obstructed? Keller hesitated. It's a public right-of-way. It needed to be clear for potential emergency vehicle access. But the primary emergency vehicle, the fire engine, was already there, doing its job, correct? It was improperly parked, Keller insisted, clinging to his narrative. Thorne leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from inquisitive to prosecutorial. Officer, are you a certified firefighter? Have you ever been trained in the tactical placement of fire apparatus during a structure fire? No, I'm a police officer. So you have no expertise that would allow you to determine whether a fire engine is improperly parked during a fire. Do you? You simply decided, based on your own opinion, that you knew better than the 20-year veteran fire captain on the scene. The city's attorney objected. Argumentative? I'll rephrase, Thorne said smoothly. Did Captain Bishop or any other firefighter explain to you why the engine was positioned where it was? They were uncooperative, Keller said. Uncooperative? Or were they busy fighting a fire? Thorne shot back. He then had the video technician play a clip from Keller's body camera, the one where Lieutenant Miller was patiently explaining that they were in the middle of fire suppression. Does that sound uncooperative to you, officer? Keller's face flushed. He was refusing a lawful order. But was the order lawful? Thorne pressed. Under city ordinance and your own department's protocols for multi-agency scenes, who is the incident commander at an active fire? Keller mumbled. The ranking fire officer. The ranking fire officer, Thorne repeated, letting the words hang in the air. That would be Captain Bishop, correct? So, in fact, you were the one refusing to follow the commands of the rightful incident commander, weren't you? You were the one who was, to use your word, obstructing. The deposition went on like this for 6 grueling hours. Thorne was relentless. He used Keller's own body camera footage, his own report, and his own department's rule book to dismantle his story, piece by piece. He forced Keller to watch the clip of him yanking David backward. Officer, in that moment, was Captain Bishop threatening you in any way? He was non-compliant. He was walking away from you to return to his duties. Is that what you consider a threat? Watch again. You can see you initiate all the physical contact. You assault him. Is that not correct? I was effecting a lawful arrest. An arrest for a crime you invented, based on an obstruction that didn't exist, in violation of your own department's policies. Is that the summary? By the end of the day, Keller was a wreck. His confident facade had crumbled, replaced by sullen, one-word answers. He had been exposed as a liar, not by Thorne's words, but by his own. The video transcript, paired with the footage itself, was an ironclad case. He had perjured himself a dozen times, contradicting the undeniable evidence of the recordings. The city's attorneys knew they were in a death spiral. Their star witness, the man their entire defense rested on, had self-destructed. After the deposition concluded, one of the attorneys approached Thorne in the hallway. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "Marcus," he said, "I think we need to talk. Maybe it's time we scheduled a mediation." Thorne just smiled. "I thought you might say that." Mediation was the city's last chance to avoid a public and likely catastrophic jury trial. The meeting was held in the office of a retired federal judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Judge Eleanor Vance, who now worked as a private mediator. Her job was not to rule on the case, but to facilitate a settlement, to force both sides to confront the realities of their positions without the theater of a courtroom. The morning session was spent with each side presenting their case to Judge Vance in separate rooms. The city's lawyers went first. They laid out their best possible defense, which was now tissue-thin. They argued that Officer Keller had made a mistake in judgment, a good-faith error under pressure. They stressed that the city had already taken action by placing him on leave and opening an internal investigation. They concluded by making a new settlement offer, $250,000. It was a significant jump from their initial nuisance value offer, but it was still nowhere near the reality of the situation. Then it was Thorne's turn. He didn't waste time with legal arguments. He simply set up a large monitor in the conference room. "Your Honor," he said, "I can talk for hours about civil rights and departmental negligence, or I can just show you 3 videos." He played them back to back. First, the neighbor's viral video, showing the shocking context of the arrest. Second, Keller's own body camera footage, showing his malicious intent and his lies from his own point of view. Third, he played a short, heartbreaking video deposition from the homeowners, a tearful couple describing what it was like to watch their house burn down while a cop handcuffed the man in charge of saving it. He concluded by showing the judge the deposition transcript of Officer Keller, with all the contradictory statements highlighted. When the presentation was over, Judge Vance was silent for a full minute. She looked at David, then back at Thorne. "This is the strongest case of a Fourth Amendment violation I have seen in my 40 years in the legal profession," she said bluntly. "What is it you're looking for?" "We're looking for justice," Thorne said. "And we're looking for a number so large that the city will have no choice but to fundamentally change the way it trains and supervises its officers. Our demand remains $20 million. Judge Vance nodded slowly. "Let me go talk to them." She walked back into the room with the city's attorneys. The door closed, but even from the hallway, they could hear her raised voice. The conversation lasted for over an hour. When she emerged, she looked at the city's lead attorney and simply said, "You need to get the mayor on the phone." What followed was a frantic series of calls between the conference room, the city attorney's office, and the mayor's office. The reality of their position was finally sinking in. Judge Vance had made it brutally clear to them. If this case went to a jury, they wouldn't just lose, they would be annihilated. The videos were too powerful, the officer's conduct too indefensible, and the plaintiff too sympathetic. A jury would see a decorated, heroic firefighter who was abused and humiliated for doing his job, and they would want to punish the city for it. The judge's private estimate for a potential jury award was likely even higher than Thorne's demand. The city's attorney came back into the room with Thorne and David. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. "Our offer is $1 million, he said, his voice strained. Thorne didn't even look at David. He just shook his head. "No, $5 million. That's the highest I'm authorized to go." Thorne stood up. "Then I guess we're going to trial. Thank you for your time, Judge." He began to pack his briefcase. "Wait," the city attorney said, a note of panic in his voice. "Let me make another call." This was the final stage of the negotiation. Thorne knew the city was desperate. They couldn't afford the political and financial fallout of a massive jury verdict against them. He had all the leverage, and he was not going to let go. The final offer came 20 minutes later, delivered via a speakerphone call with the city's chief counsel. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a surrender. The city agreed to a settlement that included not just a monetary payment, but a list of non-negotiable policy changes Thorne had drafted. It was a total victory. But Thorne had one last condition. He refused to let the amount be sealed by a non-disclosure agreement. He wanted the number to be public. He wanted it to be a headline. The city, battered and beaten, agreed. When the final papers were drawn up, David looked at the number. It wasn't the $20 million they had demanded, but it was a staggering figure nonetheless. And more importantly, it was attached to a binding commitment for real, systemic reform. This had never been just about the money. It was about making sure that what happened to him would never happen to another first responder in this city again. The news of the settlement hit the city like an earthquake. The headline on the front page of the Aurora Chronicle was stark and unforgiving. "City to pay fire captain $21 million in wrongful arrest lawsuit." It was a number that defied comprehension. The largest settlement for a civil rights violation in the state's history. It wasn't the $20 million Thorne had demanded. It was even more. In the final hours of mediation, as the city's liability became terrifyingly clear, Thorne had pushed for one final punitive addition, and they had folded completely. The $21 million figure wasn't just compensation, it was a punishment, a public branding of the city's failure. The fallout was immediate and widespread. The city council convened an emergency public hearing where furious citizens and off-duty firefighters packed the chamber to demand answers. The mayor and police chief O'Connell were forced to sit for hours and listen to a torrent of outrage. How could they have let this happen? Why was Officer Keller ever allowed to wear a uniform? Why did they fight the lawsuit for so long, wasting taxpayer money only to arrive at this monumental payout? The political calculus had shifted overnight. Protecting Officer Keller and the department's image was no longer a viable option. The cost of their loyalty had been tallied, and it was $21 million. 2 days after the settlement was announced, Officer Mark Keller was fired. His termination letter, which was immediately leaked to the press, cited gross misconduct, untruthfulness, and violations of multiple departmental policies. The 19 complaints that had once been brushed aside were now listed as contributing factors to his dismissal. The system that had protected him for 4 years had finally, and publicly, devoured him. He was stripped of his badge, his gun, and his career. But the consequences didn't stop there. The staggering settlement amount forced a crisis of confidence in the city's leadership. Police Chief O'Connell, who had so arrogantly defended Keller's actions at the initial press conference, was forced to resign under immense pressure from the mayor and the city council. His departure signaled a sea change in the department's culture. The old guard, with its ingrained circle-the-wagons mentality, was out. The settlement agreement that Marcus Thorne had forced upon the city included a list of mandatory reforms, which the new interim police chief was now tasked with implementing. It was a sweeping overhaul of police procedure. It required mandatory, hands-on, scenario-based training for all officers on interacting with other agencies at emergency scenes. It explicitly codified that the ranking fire official was the sole incident commander at a fire. It created a new independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate and recommend discipline for misconduct complaints. And it implemented an early warning system to flag officers, like Keller, who accumulated multiple complaints, triggering mandatory counseling and retraining. For David, the news of the settlement was a surreal vindication. The money was a life-changing sum, but it felt secondary. The real victory was in the reforms. It was in Keller's termination. It was in the chief's resignation. It was knowing that the next time a firefighter was on a ladder trying to save a home, they wouldn't have to worry about a cop with an ego trip pulling them down. He used a significant portion of the settlement to take care of the family whose home was lost on Elm Street. He bought them a new, fully furnished house in a better neighborhood, a quiet act of restorative justice that the city's checkbook couldn't provide. He knew it couldn't replace their memories, but it was a tangible way to right the most immediate wrong caused by Keller's actions. The $21 million verdict became a legend in legal and municipal circles across the country. It was a warning shot fired across the bow of every city administration and police department. It demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, the massive financial liability of keeping problem officers on the force. It proved that the cost of defending the indefensible was far greater than the cost of swift and decisive accountability. The city of Aurora had paid an exorbitant price for its arrogance, but in doing so, it had created a powerful deterrent that would protect countless other first responders and citizens in the years to come. The city hadn't just settled a lawsuit, it had been forced to buy a conscience. The impact of David Bishop's case radiated far beyond the city limits of Aurora. The story, amplified by the staggering $21 million settlement, became a national talking point about the relationship between police and other emergency services. The viral video and Keller's body cam footage were no longer just evidence in a lawsuit. They became powerful educational tools. At police and fire academies across the country, the Elm Street incident became a required case study. It was dissected in classrooms under titles like Interagency Cooperation and Conflict and The Dangers of Jurisdictional Ego. Recruits watched the footage and were forced to analyze the cascade of failures that led to the arrest. They broke down Keller's tactical errors, his verbal missteps, and his catastrophic misunderstanding of his role at an emergency scene. Conversely, they studied David's composure, his professionalism, and his commitment to his primary mission in the face of unbelievable interference. The footage was a perfect, real-world example of what to do, and, more importantly, what not to do. But the most significant and lasting change came at the state level. Inspired by the public outcry and lobbied heavily by the state's firefighters' union, a bipartisan group of state legislators drafted a new piece of legislation. It was officially titled the Emergency Responder Protection Act, but everyone at the state capitol knew it by its unofficial name, Bishop's Law. The bill did three simple but revolutionary things. First, it legally codified that the ranking fire officer at a fire or rescue scene had ultimate command authority over the entire scene, including the actions of law enforcement until the emergency was declared over. Second, it made it a felony for any person, including a peace officer, to willfully interfere with a firefighter or paramedic performing their official duties during an active emergency. Third, it created civil liability protection for any first responder who reported such interference, shielding them from departmental retaliation. Marcus Thorne and David Bishop were invited to testify at the legislative hearings. David, dressed in his fire department dress uniform, stood before the committee and didn't talk about his arrest or the lawsuit. He talked about the fire. He described the physics of a flashover, the precious seconds it takes for a situation to go from controllable to catastrophic. He talked about the promise he made to the homeowners on Elm Street. "When we arrive, people are having the worst day of their lives," David said, his voice steady and clear. "They trust us to help. My only job in that moment is to save lives and property. I shouldn't have to do that while also fighting off a police officer who thinks moving a fire engine is more important than a family's home. This bill isn't about protecting me. It's about protecting our ability to protect them." His testimony was powerful. The bill passed both houses of the legislature with overwhelming, near unanimous support. The governor signed it into law in a public ceremony on the steps of the state capitol. He handed the first pen he used to sign the bill to David Bishop. The passage of Bishop's law in their state created a ripple effect. Firefighters' unions and EMS associations in other states saw the new law as a model. They began lobbying their own legislatures, using the Aurora case as their prime example. Within 2 years, 5 other states had passed similar legislation, and a dozen more had introduced it. David's ordeal had created a new national standard, a legal framework that rebalanced the scales and protected the integrity of emergency scenes. The reforms in Aurora also became a model for other cities struggling with police misconduct. The Civilian Oversight Board, the early warning system, the mandatory interagency training, these became best practices that were studied and adopted by municipalities looking to reform their own departments. David never sought the spotlight. He was an intensely private man who was uncomfortable with his newfound fame. But he understood the responsibility that came with it. He accepted invitations to speak at national firefighting conferences, where he would tell his story to packed auditoriums. He didn't speak with anger or bitterness. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had been tested in a fire of a different kind and had emerged stronger. His message was always the same: know your job, know your rights, and never let anyone stop you from doing what you know is right, especially when lives are on the line. He had become an accidental icon, a symbol of professional integrity standing firm against unwarranted authority. The name David Bishop was no longer just the name of a fire captain, it was a shorthand for courage. David Bishop eventually returned to active duty. The administrative leave was lifted, and he was back at the helm of Engine 51. Walking into the firehouse that first day felt like coming home. The familiar smell of diesel, the sight of the gleaming red engine, the easy camaraderie of his crew. It was the world he belonged to. But something had changed, both in him and in how others saw him. There was a new level of respect in the eyes of the younger firefighters, not just for his rank, but for the battle he had fought and won for all of them. His relationship with the police department was, for a time, strained at emergency scenes. He could feel the eyes of the police officers on him. Some looked at him with resentment, as the man who had cost their department a fortune and a chief. Others, however, looked at him with a quiet acknowledgement, a tacit admission that he had been in the right over time, As the new training and protocols took hold, the culture began to shift. The interactions at scenes became more professional, more collaborative. The bright, clear line drawn by Bishop's law had replaced ambiguity with certainty. There were no more jurisdictional squabbles. The new generation of cops coming out of the academy had studied his case. They understood the rules. He never saw Mark Keller again. He heard through the grapevine that Keller had moved out of state, unable to find work in law enforcement again. His name was now permanently associated with the infamous viral video, a cautionary tale for any rookie with a power trip. The settlement money afforded David a comfortable life, but he didn't change his lifestyle. He still lived in the same modest house. He still drove the same pickup truck. He established a charitable foundation in his name, the Bishop Fund for First Responders, which provided legal aid and support to firefighters and paramedics who faced retaliation or wrongful termination for upholding their professional ethics. His fight had become a shield for others. He had taken the worst day of his career and forged it into a tool to protect his brothers and sisters in the service. He continued to work as a fire captain for another 10 years, responding to calls, teaching rookies, and leading by example, before finally retiring with a full pension and the undying respect of the department he had served. And in many ways, saved. The legacy of the fire on Elm Street wasn't just in the laws that were changed or the money that was paid. It was in the thousands of future emergency scenes that would unfold with quiet professionalism instead of chaotic conflict, in the homes that would be saved, and the lives that would not be lost because of a lesson learned the hard way. The story of David Bishop and Mark Keller is more than a story of a hero and a villain. It's a deep look into the psychology of authority and the pressures that can warp it. Mark Keller didn't wake up that morning planning to ruin a family's life. He was a product of a system that rewarded aggression and conflated compliance with respect. In his mind, the badge was not a symbol of public trust, but a tool of absolute control, the fire engine. A symbol of a different kind of authority, represented a challenge he couldn't tolerate. For Keller, a man likely driven by deep-seated insecurity, yielding control to a fire captain, a black fire captain at that, was an unacceptable blow to his ego. His actions weren't a result of a split-second mistake, but the logical conclusion of a worldview forged by poor training, a lack of accountability, and a culture that taught him his authority was paramount in every situation. Looking back, one might wonder if David could have done anything differently. What if he had been more deferential or tried to placate Keller's ego? The result likely would have been the same. The house would have been lost during the delay, and a dangerous precedent would have been set, signaling that police officers could intimidate other first responders into compromising their mission. What if he had simply ordered his men to ignore Keller completely? The outcome might have been a dangerous physical altercation involving his entire crew. In reality, David walked the only path available to a true professional. He stated his duty, upheld his responsibility, and accepted the consequences, trusting that the system, however flawed, would eventually recognize the truth. His calm refusal to be drawn into an argument was, in itself, the most powerful form of de-escalation he had. This story teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of true authority. It does not come from a badge, a uniform, or a title. It comes from competence, integrity, and a commitment to a purpose greater than oneself. David Bishop's authority was earned over 20 years of running into burning buildings, while Mark Keller's was merely borrowed from the institution he represented, an institution he ultimately failed. The ultimate protection, for David and for all of us, was the truth, captured on camera and amplified by a community that refused to accept injustice. It reminds us that in the modern age, accountability can come from anywhere. and that the courage of one individual can truly be enough to challenge a system and change it for the better. What would you have done if you were in Captain Bishop's position? Do you believe the $21 million settlement was a fair outcome for what happened? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.